Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to TCAP training. My name is Azra Syed. I'm a TCAP training coordinator. Today's training is on Port Authority security guidelines and requirements, design review and process and inspection, and also acceptance process. Since I am recording this training, please stay muted. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer all the questions at the end of the training. Now I'll turn it over to Ryan Morales to go over the agenda and introduce the presenters.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, this afternoon. Great lineup of presenters for you this afternoon. But before we move forward, as usual, we like to hear from you. Take a moment, scan this QR code. I'll be able to put the link in the chat box in a few. But we want to hear from you guys. We want to hear how did our presenters do? They love to appreciate and really appreciate the feedback. We share it with them, and also for the future. If there's any specific topics you would like for us to touch, let us know as well. It's anonymous. It's completely anonymous. So you can feel free to share your thoughts. Today, for security guidelines and requirements, we have Margaret Taylor. She is the Assistant Director for Aviation Security, and Philip Finamore, who is the Senior Program Manager as well in the security team. We have Daniel Pineda from the Resident Engineer's Office at LaGuardia Airport with the construction phase. And we have Edwin Vasquez, who is the supervising principal engineer, who would have the inspection process for this part. And without further ado, I think we can cut it short and pass it over to Margaret with the rest of this.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. As Ryan stated, my name is Margaret Taylor Finucane. I'm the Assistant Director of Aviation Security Programs. As such, I oversee our airport security programs for all of our airports, commercial airports, being JFK, Newark, LaGuardia, and Stewart. So basically, we're going to present here how we got to the security requirements and why they're required. Most of our information and our best practices and what we're doing now grew out of the construction of the World Trade Center. As you know, we suffered huge damage there, so we wanted to make sure that moving forward, the security was baked in and initiated at the start of any project or any major alteration. So I'm just going to get right into our presentation now. Next page, please. So we've developed the security guidelines for our departments, all our line departments. I work in aviation, but I'm going to speak on behalf of all our line departments, TB&T, ports, and PATH. So what these guidelines do is they supplement the existing building codes and applicable regulatory requirement, so they're above and beyond. They codify established agency security requirements and industry best practices, and they maintain uniformity across our agency facilities for plan and design and construction and operation. Who is it applicable to? As I stated already, it's applicable to any new build. So for example, JFK redevelopment, the new terminal at Newark, which was recently opened, or the security requirements that we had at that time, of course, it's always evolving, were implemented, and they will be constructed with all the security requirements that we have. It's also applicable to any new leases or renewals. What we do in those instances is in the line departments, our staff goes out and they review that site. They look to see what they need. They do site surveys. And based on that, they give their recommendations or requirements for the security requirements to properties to share with the tenants. And with respect to alterations or renovations and modifications, our guidelines are proportionate to the type of lease, the term of the lease, the age of the facility. So we look at that. We take a reasonable standard as to what security measures we will have implemented in existing facilities or under existing leases that are supplements. Next page, please. Okay. As I stated before, we've developed guidelines. We then actually put them into a book for everyone to look at. I'm going to say a book or a manual for everyone to look at. This is a comprehensive collection of, as I said, global best practices, which address the following areas: physical security, utility infrastructure, physical layouts, security technology, and security operation and practices. These have been developed over time. As I stated, World Trade Center was our first priority when it came to security, obviously. That guideline was developed in March of 2018. The airports aviation guideline was developed and implemented in December of 2019. TB&T and PATH published theirs in January of 2022, and Seaports published theirs in February of 2022. Some of these are available online. Other ones are not. For example, you see World Trade Center. It's noted as confidential, so therefore it applies to our information security policy and the confidentiality. So you would need to reach out directly to the resident engineer at World Trade Center to obtain copies of that. It would involve a non-disclosure agreement and all the other requirements of our information security policy in order to view that. The airport security guidelines manual is available on the Port Authority website, as well as reach out to any resident engineer to obtain a copy of that. Next slide, please. So a planning and design review. So how do we determine the measures? We determine them, we look at the recommended security overview during the lease negotiations. That ties into the site survey. Then we conduct the site survey with sufficient notice. We will notify the tenants that we will, if there's an existing tenant, that we will look at the property, survey it. We'll identify security specific issues, and it will, I ask all tenants to meet with the facility security manager to determine the security classifications. And the reference is a document called Security Planning Guidelines. I will ask that be supplied to everybody who's on this call. So when you perform TAA reviews, you need to look at all the guidelines, the federal codes and regulations, and then we work towards approval or conditional approval. And I'm going to turn it over now to Phil to talk about what our review is in the approval process. So Phil Finnemore.
Thank you, Margaret.
Next.
So my name is Phil Finnemore. I'm the Senior Program Manager. I'm located at the Port Authority Tech Center in Jersey City. Main focus is on, for me, is my portfolio is ports and the aviation sites. However, what I will be referring to during this brief presentation kind of applies to all line departments. So Ryan, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so just as a brief overview of the various stakeholders on our side here, it's Security Compliance Review Team. Different layers that make our team whole. We have the on-site security managers, aviation, general oversight managers, Mervyn Peter, and then every aviation site or every one of our facilities has a distinct representative that would be your go-to for the initial assessment. And so on and so forth. If you look at TB&T, it's Tony Gordon, PATH is Joseph Wayne, and so on and so forth. Security Project Management Technical Design Standards. Myself, Phil Finnemore, my colleague Sergio Martinez, which he heads off the TB&T, PATH, and World Trade Center. And then we do have access to 7 external call-in consultants that have different expertise factors depending on the type of project, if it exceeds what we can handle in-house. So we do have those resources readily available on an as-needed basis. So this slide here is just a general oversight of the different layers within the Port Authority to support security reviews. Next slide, please. Security audit process. So as Margaret mentioned earlier, once you identify the project needs, you go through the security guidelines, you identify the different levels of security. And based on the different levels of security, you'll have a better understanding of what security measures need to be accounted for in your submissions. The audit process is what our office here does. In prior years, we wouldn't really have much of a say or much of a review process with TAAs, and several years back, that has been changed to allow us to have a review pretty much like anyone else, whether it's an architectural review, a life safety review, quality assurance review. Security is just another layer within that process. The audits ensure the security provisions are compliant with the approved TAA design documents and meet the security intent. They're conducted by facility security operations during and after construction. During construction, after construction, but more importantly, during design, which we have some slides that refer to that as well. Early action of being able to understand security needs helps, because when we do have to perform our security audits before any space gets turned over for beneficial use, it allows us to pretty much know what is expected of our reviews, pretty consistent to any other design standards. Some checklists developed for pre-inspection verification by TA designer and contract with more to follow. So there are checklists out there depending on the type of project. The security guidelines manual, if you just thumb through it, it's 40-ish sheets or pages within the book. It's a user-friendly guide. We don't prescribe exactly what you need to do, but we just give you guidance with the understanding that each project is specific, each site is unique, and it's just a matter of being able to put everything together to satisfy those needs. The list of staff that I was on the earlier slide, that is helpful because often we do welcome the opportunity to do a walkthrough before any TAs are submitted to avoid unnecessary comments or issues during the design process. We know at that point in time, once the project is real and moving forward, time is of the essence. We audit deficiencies list. There's an audit deficiency list which is provided by the facility resident engineer's office arranged for resolution and reinspection. Again, by having the design vetted early on, by understanding what we will be looking for during these audits, all documents that are readily available during the process, it just helps that when we get to the point that the resident engineer's office has a structured inspection, that we have that many less things to have to look at during the more formal process. Next slide, please. Common errors and omissions. Different levels of security are required depending on the work area location, restricted versus public areas. So when you look at the security guidelines manual, there's always that understanding that it's not one solution for every scenario. We do look at renovations versus new builds differently. We do look at what is the overall investment compared to what this new security investment would entail. So it is on a case-by-case basis. This list here are just examples of common TA submittal errors and omissions that we see quite too often. Unfortunately, quite too often. I think if there's any takeaway today, this list here of understanding some of these basic items that are always looked at when we do our audits or reviews during the TA process, we can chip away at this list alone. I think you'll find that the first time approval process will be improved drastically. A few examples. Exclude applicable security zone drawings, public secured sterile areas, etc. Quite too often we're provided with drawings for the subject work area, but there's no delineation of where the public secured and sterile areas are. And therefore, while we do have the knowledge of where those areas are, it is the reason for rejection because it needs to be documented, and the relationship of these locations relative to your project is very important for our review. Excluded comprehensive CCTV coverage plan for both sides of security zone access points and areas open to the public, terminal frontage, etc., for awareness and forensic use. Again, another item that's in our guidelines manual, we do give guidance as to what needs to be covered. We do define what comprehensive CCTV means. The guidelines were established to avoid subjective criteria. So we find that by having the guidelines out there since 2019 for the aviation sites, it helps remove the subjective level of what previously people would think that were just wish lists. So again, try to embrace that and look at those specific categories if it applies to your improvement or your project. Failure to maintain minimum standoff from perimeter or site-specific areas if applicable. Again, a very basic one. And what this means is we do have a 10-foot buffer on air side to fence and land side to fence. And that could be as simple as an electric cabinet. It can be just regular storage boxes, cabinets. It can be a bollard. It could be a guide rail. All of these things that create and it improves an ease for someone getting over the AOA fence is why we're looking for that standoff. Sometimes we can't avoid it. So we do have solutions for how to maintain a particular infrastructure closer to the 10 feet. We don't like it, but there are, on a case-by-case scenario, solutions on how we can work with you to get that through the approval process. Failure to maintain, failure to include roof hatches and security door schedules, and to identify adjustments for computerized access control system. So roof hatches typically in the architectural world aren't really something that is identified in a door schedule. Here we do ask that they are identified in door schedules because in fact it is an access point, and that does coincide with the CACS system and the electronics documents that are part of that application as well. Failure to provide a construction security plan for review and approval prior to construction. This is a basic one. I would say probably more so than ever before. We've been seeing a lot of submissions not being site specific. Often entities do retain the services of designers, contractors, et cetera, that have knowledge in the process. They've been around the block. They've had submittals for other tenants performing work. And they tend to use boilerplate. They tend to use documents that were previously approved for other projects. Unfortunately, it's the cause for a lot of rejection because it's not site specific. You can use those lessons learned to build on your application or your submittal, but however, it has to be site specific. Failure to recognize and address specific security requirements for different or changed types of occupancy and use. Again, another major component. If you have something that, as today, it's a Hudson News or a Starbucks or a coffee station, and it's of a different operational function, and there's different access points, there's different deliveries, there's different use groups, the use group has to adapt to the security needs. It's not that something is there before, there's a reduced level of security there before. It may have been fine for what was there previously. Your application must comply to the current standards for security. Next slide, please. Keys to success. Maintain close working relationships with the TCAP coordinators. Include facility security coordinators in various processes, kickoff meetings, pre-construction meetings, pre-reviews during design, site tours, etc. Again, we have access to resources. We do welcome the opportunity to do site tours in advance of any submittals, as I mentioned earlier. We prefer that actually. We prefer doing the site tour. There's a lot of things that happen on site through a conversation and can avoid a lot of resubmitting of lengthy documents. Take the contact information that we will offer and embrace it, and definitely reach out to each of the individuals on an as-needed basis. If in fact you have a unique project and you just want to talk it through before any formal submittals. Maintain frequent communications with the security coordinators for guidance and support. We do cursory reviews or over-the-shoulder reviews, however you want to reference it, in advance of any formal submittals. We have no problem taking a look at things in advance to make sure that everything is in order. And again, not to say that is a guarantee that we may miss something and then the formal submittal may be a cause of a rejection. However, we do our best to offer guidance up front, and we welcome the opportunity to review things in advance of your submittal. Discuss changes in design and/or use with facility security coordinators as early as possible. And to conduct pre-inspection walkthroughs with the engineer architect of record to verify compliance in advance of formal TA inspections. We mentioned that a few times. That's a very important statement. It's just a one-liner, but very important to the success of a formal approval once everything is completed in place. And we do use the drawings that were approved as a back check for these audits. Next slide, please.
Oh, back to me.
Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Lastly, we're going to speak about the Secure Workers Access Consortium, otherwise known as SWAC. What SWAC is, it provides for a positive verification, identity verification of employees that will be working at our sites. It also includes a criminal history background screening, as well as the employees' names being run against the TSA, which is what's called the TSC watch list. SWAC has developed because of, again, the construction at the World Trade Center. We want to ensure that we do not have any individuals who could potentially pose a security risk to our airports. So even though these may not be in quote unquote security areas, regulated security areas, it is required where individuals have restricted access or they're near a federal secured area. So just to reiterate, it's necessary when non-agency employees, meaning non-Port Authority employees, require access to the agency's confidential privileged or confidential security related information. When they're accessing mission critical systems, which are Port Authority applications that if anything happened to them, if there was a cyber hacking event, it could impact our operations. And when they require unescorted access to the agency's controlled access areas, which are not federally regulated, as I've already stated. What is meant by controlled access areas? I'll give you a few examples. These can be HVAC, utility rooms, again, any areas that would impact operations if an individual who intends to do something to our airports can get access to those areas. And if we have a link to the website here, which gives more information on SWAC, and if your employees need to apply for it. Just want to note that anybody can get a SWAC. They don't have to be working at Port Authority agencies. So if individuals want to have that before they're even employed, it's not restricted to that individual having to work at one of our agencies. Anybody can get SWAC'd. And if you have any further questions, you can reach out to Jason, as noted here, or their customer service address. Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of our section of the presentation, but there'll be more to come from others.
Yes, thank you very much, Margaret and Philip. Before we move on to the next phase, which is the construction phase with Daniel from the LaGuardia office, we want to ask if there's any question for the security team at this time before we move forward. Feel free to type them in the chat box. We can read them. Or if you want to unmute yourselves at this time, please feel free to do so before we move forward. Okay, please remember again, you can type your questions in the chat box. Again, we're going to have another Q&A section at the end of the presentation. And we'll go ahead and read those questions towards the end. We can move forward. And Daniel?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel with the Resident Engineer's Office at LaGuardia Airport. Go to the next slide. I'll be going over the construction process of a tenant construction or alteration process, focusing on the Resident Engineer's Office roles and responsibilities with an emphasis on security. So thank you, Margaret and Phil, for a wonderful presentation. So the Resident Engineer's Office, we maintain as the primary Port Authority point of contact from the moment that the TA goes into pre-construction all the way to closeout. So we ensure that the project is successful by guiding the team through all the phases of the project. We coordinate between the tenant team and the PA facility and the various groups for all construction activities. And our primary responsibilities are to audit and monitor the tenant's contractor and EOR to ensure that they're building in conformance with the PA-approved contract documents, specs, permits, and applicable codes, adhering to all TCAP procedures. The resident engineer's office will attend and coordinate with the various PA units, which could include the Port Authority Facility Security Coordinators, to attend and witness any ongoing construction, tests, or inspections. The REO will confirm via field verification that all work being requested or certified by the AUR is complete prior to scheduling a Port Authority inspection, and that the REO will issue inspection minutes noting any inspection comments, and we will track those comments to ensure that they're resolved prior to scheduling a reinspection. Next slide, please. Moving on to design, or phase one, I just want to emphasize that the tenant and the AUR must conduct a site visit prior to contract document submission to identify existing conditions within the site, which can include above, below, or surrounding, to identify anything that could become an obstruction during construction or delay the project. So we want to identify obstructions, existing utilities, any tying locations, any exposure to the elements that could affect the requirements of the project. And again, this is all just to identify anything that could impede the project. So we want to understand from the resident engineer's office perspective the constructability of the project, and we want to get an understanding of the scope of work. So we will review all of the documents that will explain the phasing plans, the logistics, and staging areas. We want to understand the work zones to see that if there's any work that might come near or within AOA area, that would be delineated on a drawing so that everybody would be aware when performing the review. We want to get an understanding of the scope of work based on the complexity of a project. We would want to understand whether there's any enhanced security requirements, understanding all the materials required and details of installation, whether that's the pipe sizing, support spacing, the thickness and type of material, whether the equipment called out on the drawings are new versus modifications to existing. We want to understand the make and model, just to get an idea of, again, the scope of work and the constructability. We want to make sure that the drawings are coordinated between disciplines. So a common example is a security door that might be located within an egress path. So code takes precedence. So we want to make sure that the crash bars are provided. That would be something that would be coordinated between the various disciplines. And of course, all required special inspections must be listed on the drawings. The resident engineer's office will monitor all design comments throughout construction to ensure that any changes to the design as a result of any comments are implemented in the field and resolved. And we recommend that the AUR design the project according to the phased occupancy as envisioned by the tenant. And the goal during the design phase is to reach a no further comment design determination prior to a pre-construction meeting, which we'll go into on the next slide, please. So at the pre-construction meeting, we can begin collecting pre-con documents as soon as a contractor is identified, but the design must reach at a minimum conditional approval prior to scheduling a pre-construction meeting. At the pre-con, we'll discuss whether or not there's any open rider comments and a path to a no further comments. We want to make sure we have an approved MWBE plan, certificate of insurance, health and safety plan, approved security plan. This is very critical, again, based on the complexity and the scope of work of the project. We'll go over the general contractor's detailed schedule, making sure that the contractor includes in their schedule and calls out for any anticipated third-party inspections or tests, AUR walkthroughs, pre-inspections or pre-tests. We want to make sure that we account for official Port Authority inspections and tests, and include a timeline for addressing any punch list items, and also identifying any critical go live dates or milestones. That way, Port Authority is aware of any upcoming dates and we can begin to prepare ahead of time. We want to review any site work zones or required security fencing. We want to make sure we review the excavation requirements, so 811 call before you dig, get an understanding of the maintenance of traffic plans, site safety, required special inspections, and we will go over the AEOR and contractor responsibilities. I want to emphasize that the AEOR is responsible for 100% of the work and inspections. So we ask the AEOR to discuss the scope of work, any critical elements of work, what the inspection strategy is to ensure that all the required special inspections are performed in a timely manner, and if there's any phased occupancy. The inspection process meeting is an optional meeting that is recommended for more complex projects where the resident engineer's office would invite the various PA groups to go over the expectations of each required inspection. And going on to construction progress, the architect or engineer of record is expected to ensure that all elements of work are complete prior to requesting an inspection. The REO role is only to monitor and audit all the field work, which can include all third-party special inspections and tests. Port Authority REO will verify all materials used on site match the PA-approved contract drawings. We ensure that all work is complete per the latest approved drawings and free of deficiencies prior to scheduling a request for official PA audit inspection. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go over some of the typical deficiencies in terms of Port Authority security requirements. So first and foremost, all work is required to be installed as per the latest PA-approved contract documents per the Port Authority Tenant Construction Review Manual and must be code compliant. That's the architect or engineer of record's responsibility to ensure that it is. And this is where we see most of our deficiencies, that the contractor strays from the approved drawings. So we want to make sure that the general contractor follows the approved security plan and ensuring that guards or escorts are used as required. So typical deficiencies that we see, again, varying from what's on the approved drawings. If the CCTV installed isn't matching what's on the approved drawings, we'll see that oftentimes there's lacking coverage. So we'll need to add additional CCTV cameras. Security door schedule noted on the approved drawings is incomplete or does not match the field installation, which would include adding in all the appropriate or required hardware. Maintaining proper clearance during construction when you're working adjacent to a temporary or permanent AOA fence line. So not storing material too close to that fence. Making sure that all new and relocated AOA fence is installed properly. If it's not, it could be an issue at an inspection prior to activating an AOA fence. So if a gap is found at a post location, that would be a deficiency that would have to be addressed prior to activating that fence, or if the razor ribbon is missing. Again, I just want to emphasize the importance of ensuring that the security doors are installed with all the appropriate hardware. So if it's in the path of egress, making sure that the crash bars are installed and function properly, making sure that there's no locks in the path of egress that could prevent somebody from leaving in the event of an emergency, because again, code will take precedence. Doors having the proper hardware, the magnetic switches, electric locks, hinges, horn strobes are just more examples. And during construction, all workers should be displaying the appropriate identification, whether that's CITA, SWAC, or contractor badges. Next slide, please. Going over field conditions and scope changes, I just want to emphasize again the importance of the AUR site visit during the design phase, which is to avoid any field conditions that could result in additional scope or field changes. So during construction, if there's any changes, the architect or engineer of record is responsible for notifying the resident engineer's office immediately of any field conditions, and the resident engineer will determine the best path to capture those conditions, whether that's through an official scope change for Port Authority QED design standards review or captured in the as-built. Typically, for fire and life safety or code-related items, the AUR must submit an official scope change for review. If the field changes are minor, they can usually be captured in the as-built, again, with the resident engineer's concurrence. That's the key. But the resident engineer's office must be appraised as soon as anything comes up. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to inspections. All inspections are scheduled by the resident engineer's office through receipt of official signed and sealed AUR certification request packages. They must be reviewed and approved by the REO prior to scheduling an inspection. and no inspections will be conducted on scopes of work with open design comments or installations deviating from the latest PA approved drawings. So this is why it's very critical that during the design phase prior to the pre-con, we have a no further comment design determination. This is to avoid delays in scheduling inspections. We require that an AUR or representative who's knowledgeable of the scope of the inspection is present, along with contractor personnel and any subs that are required to perform the inspection. So the contractor must be prepared to operate, test, demonstrate, or make any repairs on site during the inspection. And this is all to minimize the number of inspection comments that are generated during an inspection. At the conclusion of each inspection, REO will review all inspection minutes, all inspection comments generated, and issue official minutes. Next slide, please. The AUR certification request package consists of the following documents: an AUR cover letter, a PH 212 for a partial inspection or a PH 314 for a final, a sketch showing the area being certified. So this is only for a partial inspection, and if it's applicable, if the scope of the inspection can be outlined on the contract drawings, then a sketch may not be applicable. And if a sketch is included, we require that it includes a unique sketch number, the TA number and title, a date, a legend identifying the area or scope of work being certified, and an AUR professional seal and signature. All miscellaneous notes and any notes that aren't related to the sketch should be removed or whited out. And a special inspections checklist is also required, and any applicable special inspection and test results to include NFPA forms. If it's a final certification, record drawings are required, and we ask that the as-built be reviewed with the resident engineer's office prior to record drawing submission. Next slide, please. We're going to go over the differences between a partial and a final inspection. So a final inspection should be the last inspection on a project, and it's used when all work for the entire TAA is complete, where a partial inspection is used when all work within a specific area is complete. And this is where the phasing plans come into play. So if there's 2 phases to a project and all work within one phase, or let's say one room is complete and the tenant wants to request occupancy or beneficial use, we would request a partial inspection for that specific area, but all work would have to be complete. A partial inspection not for occupancy is used prior to closing access to an area that requires inspection. So this would include inside of a wall for an in-wall or above ceiling inspection. If there's any floor penetrations that have to be inspected prior to being closed up, these are scenarios where a partial inspection not for occupancy would be required. A partial inspection for occupancy, as I mentioned, is when beneficial use is requested by the tenant. And I just want to reiterate, required documents at the PA inspection. We ask that the architect or engineer of record is on site and prepared to pull up or show any contract drawings, documents, submittals, RFIs, shop drawings. If any questions come up or may arise during the inspection, again, this just helps to minimize the number of inspection comments generated during the inspection. Next slide, please. Moving on to key takeaways and tips for success during construction. First and foremost, striving for full design approval prior to the pre-con meeting will reduce or minimize any delays in scheduling official inspections. Recommending that the EOR performs an on-site walkthrough as the design is under review. Communication is the key to success, keeping the REO appraised of all field issues and scope changes. The architect or engineer of record and general contractor are to coordinate with the REO well in advance for any anticipated inspections or tests, appraising us of any pre-inspections or pre-testing prior to official inspections so that the REO can elect to attend and coordinate with other PA groups to also attend. Planning ahead, contractor to provide a 2-week look ahead and advance notice for all upcoming tenant milestones, tests, or inspections. And when there's any inspection comments generated during an inspection, we ask that they're addressed in a timely manner. We recommend a maximum 2-week time frame to abate all items. And once all items are resolved, the architect or engineer of record will confirm it and issue an official re-inspection request. That concludes the REO's portion of the of the presentation. I'll pass it back to Ryan to continue the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll pass the baton back to Edwin with the final part of this presentation with the inspection process.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Good afternoon, everybody. So I am the principal engineer for QAD Construction Standards Unit, predominantly right now at JFK Airport, very heavily involved in the redevelopment projects, which some of you are familiar with. So we're going to go over what exactly QAD looks for on a security project. And some of you may already know, having worked with QAD, that our primary focus is auditing the work to confirm that all life safety systems are in place, properly installed, functioning, and some of that could include new work, or sometimes it includes new work that ties into existing work. And in any of those instances, we confirm that those systems are all tied together and properly working. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So basically, as part of what I had mentioned, there's an inspection process and then there's an audit process. So the previous REO function discussed the inspection process, and with QAD, the audit process is really what we focus on, and that process involves design review, which is what was discussed in the REO presentation just now, where the design goes to a group within QAD that covers the contract drawings and the designs for code compliance. So that function of QAD reviews compliance for building code, basically on paper when it's in the design development phase. During the construction phase, that's where the construction standards and inspections group of QAD gets involved to audit the construction and the consistency of that construction to the contract drawings. So typically on a standard TAA project, a tenant alteration application project, the examples of security work that affect life safety could include doors, door hardware, and also maintaining egress routes. Egress is a major life safety element that we ensure is compliant both with building code and also with practical measures and how that ties into the security systems to basically maintain both protocols throughout the project and after. So all egress doors shall be readily accessible from the side where the direction of travel is established. And these routes have to allow for movement along the egress routes that are established in the contract drawings. So basically the engineer of record, in conjunction with all the stakeholders, which involves security and other aspects of a project, have to make sure that they coordinate and maintain proper egress, and all of that is established during the design phase. So an example of a situation where egress could be affected on a security project is where you have an assembly occupancy where you might propose a delayed egress approach. Now, this is a non-compliant code situation, because in any kind of emergency situation, the minute an alarm is basically detected or activated, emergency condition immediately goes into play, and egress needs to flow freely. So those types of situations could sometimes prevent passive flow for egress, and sometimes could be an obstruction. So it's important to maintain all of that during the design phase, but then during construction, you have to make sure that all of that is properly implemented and tested to make sure that egress is always available in emergency conditions. So on larger projects, such as the redevelopment effort that's currently going on at JFK, has already been well underway at LaGuardia and also at Newark Airport, things could get pretty hairy. And some of these larger jobs require phasing that includes capturing certain sites for construction work. Now, obviously, that's going to affect some of the egress routes. So, on paper, we have to make sure that site mitigation plans are established, site capture plans are developed that basically satisfy egress and also maintain proper security protocols. And all of that needs to be coordinated just to ensure that egress from any area is maintained while an area is being occupied by the public. So it can get very interesting when you're capturing certain site for a construction project and you're also maintaining the existing level of egress from existing areas that are being affected by new construction. Um, the security fencing sometimes becomes a difficult situation where um, sometimes the security fencing in the areas are captured and sometimes can coordinate with actual construction site capturing. So that's obviously something that needs to be maintained and also discussed during construction design. But as we all know, certain modifications come into play during construction, and all of that needs to be coordinated. Security fencing is obviously a major part of some of these large projects, especially when you're doing work on the AOA. So any airside work is critical to maintain the proper construction, site capture, and also security fencing, just to make sure that areas are properly maintained and protocols are upheld. So during design phase, it's very important that the stakeholders are all involved on the project to agree on how egress is maintained and also security protocols in sensitive areas are maintained at the same time. Next slide, please. So in new buildings, planning and coordination of egress happens very early in the design phase, and so is security and egress during these discussions. They need to be maintained. Obviously, keeping all the stakeholders involved to discuss how these two elements are implemented in the design is very, very critical. So this needs to be paid attention to very early in the design phase on a project. Extra attention needs to be maintained and given to this stage of a project in the very early design stage to ensure that egress elements are are basically maintained and they don't fall through the cracks during the design changes. Sometimes you might have a modification of a certain area where you might capture a little more site than you originally planned to, or maybe you have to return a certain area back to existing space. But how does that affect egress and how is that maintained? So one example of a critical coordination that would need to be included is establishing locations of fire command and security monitoring desk. Obviously, these are two critical areas that need to be established and also need to be very strategic on how they're located. So they need to be established very early in the design phase, just to ensure that these locations are strategic enough to be effective at monitoring all the life safety systems and also security systems all at once. They work hand in hand. So obviously these areas, while they may be established during design, we have to make sure that they're maintained during construction. Certain changes, as we all know, revisions to designs, certain existing conditions that were never established early during design might pop up during construction, and then we start shifting things around. But establishing some of these critical areas like fire command and the security desk, they're very important to be maintained. So common strategies to implement when coordinating egress and security are avoiding any work that limits egress and in some instances prevents it completely from moving from an area of a lower security level to a higher security level. That should be prevented as much as possible. And again, during design changes, you might have modifications where something might change, but that needs to be maintained. We have to try to prevent anyone traveling during on an egress route in an emergency condition from an area of a lower security level to higher security level. So, for example, moving occupants in an emergency condition from landside areas to AOA or to sterile areas should be avoided as much as possible. unless, of course, you run into a condition where you might have travel distances that are exceeded, and certain conditions might require you to do that. But at all possible costs, we should try to avoid those situations. So egress from sterile areas to back of house areas should also be avoided as much as possible. It's obviously a logistical nightmare for security, but it also has to maintain the proper level of egress in order to have people safely and freely exit the building in an emergency. So when inspecting and auditing emergency egress, QAD will review during all the elements that are implemented during an emergency condition. So some of these elements are the horizontal exits and fire rated corridors. Other parts of our inspections are maintaining and confirming that the work that was done, the construction work, maintains proper functioning fire alarm systems. For example, how is this confirmed? And what we do is we test alarm systems that are functioning. We ensure that any systems that are implemented don't affect the audible and visual detection during a fire alarm situation. Proper fire alarm sequencing with existing building systems or new building systems, and how they tie into the fire alarm system are critical during construction. Those are types of elements that QAD will test and audit to ensure that they're properly maintained. And then other protocols require relocating occupants in lieu of evacuation. Sometimes you might have an area where you're confined and you might just need to relocate occupants from one area to another in lieu of evacuating the actual building. We might have areas of refuge that are established outside on the AOA, certain muster points. All of that needs to be discussed and maintained during the design phase, but then also they have to be maintained during construction. Going back to what we were discussing with site capture areas and examples like that. So another example of what we would look at QAD does is the coordination of fire alarm events versus non-fire alarm and emergency events. You might have a security event that doesn't necessarily activate a fire alarm, and what protocols are put into place and what procedures are necessary to be activated. And obviously those are discussions that are had with the facility that are also part of the design phase with the engineer of record, and then established and maintained during construction. You might have temporary mitigations that are established during the construction phase, and then after, when the design is complete, the final product and the systems. All of those need to be coordinated, but QAD is there to assist as much as possible during the construction phase. And anytime we have those types of systems, there are changes that happen. It's the nature of the beast. And QAD tries to do as much as possible to assist with code evaluation during the field inspections and audits. And then we work with the engineers of record just to make sure that everything's established. So that basically sums up the roles and responsibilities of QAD during construction and how that relates to security. So if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Edwin. And Ezra, we can hold the recording. And one more